Hello and welcome everybody. This is Tony with Torrey again. Thank you so much for joining us. We are excited, absolutely excited to have everybody on the call tonight. We have questions. I don't think we've ever received so many questions for a webinar. So we are excited to get ready to answer these questions. All those who are new, we just want to remind you that we do all that we can to make sure that we maintain the privacy and confidentiality of all of our guests. Therefore, if you have a question, there's an app that's called the Webinar Jam app. That's where we're going to do all the communication so that you remain confidential, and the only person that will see it will be myself, and then I will read off your questions, and then Torrey will answer them. So we thank you again so very much. We enjoy doing this. We love answering your questions. We love helping people, and that's what it's all about. But I want to introduce Torrey. Let me kind of shine Torrey here. Woohoo! There's Torrey. Torrey was joining us last month, and Torrey has decided that he wants to be crazy just like Rob and I, and enjoys the passion of helping others, and therefore he's in the process of transitioning from a successful financial career to helping people struggling with addictions, specifically youth and the family systems, and helping them connect. Torrey absolutely loves working with the youth, loves helping people. We have seen great success with just talking with people, and it's just one of the greatest blessings that we have when we help people. And Torrey embodies those values. He loves doing it, and that's why we're in it. And Torrey joined the team now. It's probably been 3 months. Torrey has been about 3 months, or longer than that now.
It's been longer than that, actually. Yeah, I think it's been probably about 6 now.
6 months. See, times fly when you're having fun. But thank you so much, Torrey. Thank you for taking some of your time to take and answer our guest questions, because they vary. Do you have anything you would like to say to add on to that?
Thank you, Tony. Yeah, I'm just excited to be here. I'm excited to be able to talk about some very important issues and questions that people have in regard to not only addictive behavior and especially sexual addictions, but also just other topics that are related to sexuality and other mental health types of issues. So I'm happy to do that. Of course, I guess I would remind everybody who's joining us now that the live Q&A always presents some interesting challenges to try to find the right words at times to be able to answer those difficult questions, because some of them are difficult. So I'd appreciate your understanding as I may pause to think about an answer for you, but I'll certainly do my best, and I'm just excited to be here.
All righty. Well, and I am kind of the behind-the-scenes guy, and we'll be sending out. I'm tweeting, I'm doing the stuff here. So if I run a little behind, I apologize. But our whole focus, our whole goal is to answer your questions, so let's get right to it. The first question we have, it says, I believe part of the reasons I am addicted to porn of all sorts is that I am also attracted to people of my gender, even though I have no desire to be in such a relationship. I believe that to be truly free from porn, I need to work through these emotions with the help of a therapist. Another school of thought says sin is sin, and I need not dwell so much on why I sin repeatedly, and instead decide really does not matter why. What is your thoughts on this?
Well, so it sounds like the question is, I mean, there's some complex ideas there, but it sounds like one of the questions is, how do I manage the emotion of not wanting to act on some sexual urges related to use of pornography and even some same gender attraction kinds of urges, because for that person, it sounds like it doesn't really reconcile with, or may not reconcile with, their value system to engage in those activities. And so one of the things that I would talk about in regard to that is that definitely the therapeutic experience can certainly be a huge help in being able to make sense of that emotion and make sense of those challenges that are faced. It's interesting that many of us will face certain things that feel very difficult to manage, emotions and triggers and things that, whether it's a sexual nature or whether it's anger management or whether it's an urge to use a substance or whatever. There's a lot of similarities in terms of how the brain is operating. The brain tries to reconcile essentially two different things. It tries to reconcile instinctual urges or triggers that come from the limbic part of the brain, and it tries to reconcile that with the logic and the values-driven part of the brain, kind of the executive part of the brain in the prefrontal cortex. And so there are times when the prefrontal cortex, the logic part of the brain, will tell us, that behavior is not what you want. And you would try to make choices to not engage in that behavior. Meanwhile, it battles with the instinctual urges that may come. And they're built into a different part of the brain. And so you have kind of a tug of war going on between those two parts of the brain. And because the emotions are tied into the limbic part of the brain that also has the instincts processing along with it, they're tied very closely together. So very quickly we learn that if we engage in an instinctual behavior, such as a sexual behavior, the emotions that come with that, whether good or bad, will be tied together very strongly. And so that's why there's such a powerful challenge in trying to manage those things. So certainly, number one, understanding that is a huge help, and number two, being able to just simply process the emotions that come along with that struggle can be very beneficial, and that's why therapy is such a huge help. It can really bring out the emotion itself and really target that. And we develop what we call emotional intelligence, which is understanding what drives our emotions and why we act the way we do based on having those emotions. And simply having that understanding can really help us to have more peace as we understand that it's a human condition. It's part of being a human being to have those emotional things. And while it's difficult to have that tug of war, there is definitely the opportunity to find greater peace within that and abilities to manage not only the emotions but also the behavior and kind of find that peace and that reconciliation.
Okay, thank you very much. I always forget to do a little bit of housekeeping. Can everybody hear us okay? Please let us know. Type in okay in the chat box that we can make sure that we're not, rambling on without people able to hear us. Getting some okays, good. All right. Okay, looks like we're good to go then.
Great.
Next question is it even possible for someone to recover from addiction? Or is it so ingrained that only a select few are able to do it?
Oh, very, very deep question there, certainly. Thank you for that honest question. I think, number one, the simple answer is yes. It is very possible to recover from addiction. It happens all the time. Now, when we say recovery, I think it's important to also understand what recovery means. I think, many years ago, if you were to go back, say, 15, 20 years, even maybe within the last 10 years, you'd probably find a lot more definitions of recovery. And, some people would say, well, you sort of graduate from the process of dealing with that addiction and then you never face that again. More and more studies show and more experiences show through the therapeutic process that the reality is recovery is a lifelong management process. And so, yes, recovery can happen. Absolutely, it can happen. There are great people who recover or are in the process of recovery throughout their lives and feel like they've definitely accomplished amazing things in that process, meaning that they can manage that behavior. I think it's important to know that, especially with something like sexual addiction that involves such a very core element of our human, limbic processes, that the ability to manage that behavior is in fact a lifelong requirement because it's ingrained in us. The sexual response is part of who we are, and so knowing that that is part of being a human being, that's literally attached to our survival instincts as human beings, knowing that can help us to understand the nature of it being a long-term, lifelong process. But definitely, I think what really is important to know about in terms of recovery is that you can find peace. That's the bottom line that I think most people would say that would more often than not would actually define recovery is, can I manage the behavior and can I find peace? And so I would definitely say, without a doubt, you can find peace and you can find the ability to manage that, be able to balance those brain-oriented, the limbic responses that come with that sexual behavior and that sexual instinct, to feel good about it, to feel positive, to feel like there's hope and there's progress, a lifelong process that can happen that brings great peace and balance in one's life. You can, essentially manage it to the point where the negative consequences that come with addiction can be essentially mitigated so that there is great peace and balance and happiness in life. So, very good question. I think that comes with a lot of concern that individuals who struggle for a long time are not able to feel like they're making progress. Some of that, I guess I would kind of branch over into another area to answer that question. Some of that has to do with the idea of willpower. Many people will struggle with willpower. Willpower is useful to an extent, but it has limitations. We can sort of white knuckle it, as we call it, to do our best to get through something, and sometimes we may be successful and other times not. And so the idea behind recovery in a therapeutic sense is that it's not just a matter of holding tight and using willpower to get through a trigger or a situation that's difficult. It's definitely gaining abilities beyond just a willpower to be able to find greater peace with that.
I want to echo that because just in the experience that I've had helping with people online, I've seen absolutely tremendous success with people who say that they weren't going to be able to do that. How could we help them? And then we just told them, give us a try. It's not going to hurt you. And they did, and now some of them are 2, 3, 4 years sobriety of not actually even acting out, which is phenomenal, especially with somebody who's gone 52 years of continuous acting out. So can you find recovery? Absolutely. I echo that 100%. Okay, this then kind of relates to the first question. I'm a straight man, but attracted to transsexual or gay porn. Why?
Well, very good question. There's a lot that we're currently learning about this area in terms of same-gender attraction or activities that relate to same-gender activities. So, I guess I would first say that there's still a lot that we're learning about that as studies are carried out and as we gain a greater understanding of the nature of same-gender attraction. Ultimately, the answer to why that would ever be appealing to anybody is essentially the same answer as why any kind of a sexual experience is appealing, which is that it comes from a natural instinctual part of the brain. It's built in. So many people are familiar with kind of two parts of the brain that we often talk about in the process of addiction recovery, the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. And the limbic system has some survival components built right into that, one of which is sex itself. Now, some people would question, well, is sex really a survival requirement? You know, is it comparable to, say, air and water and food? And so I guess in terms of literally surviving right now as of this moment, no, it's not a requirement to be in a sexual experience to survive. But the human race is designed to be sexual in order to survive as a race. And so the idea of sexual drive being an important part of our limbic system and our limbic processes is very important for understanding that is why we have any kind of a sexual impulse. Now, obviously, there are plenty of sexual experiences that we experience that we want to experience. Some are unwanted and confusing. And I think that there are those who experience some of the same gender attraction that are confused by that. And they may wonder, well, why is that my experience? Especially if they say, well, I don't want to choose that kind of relationship or choose that kind of life experience. It's sort of like it chose me, so to speak. And so while there's a lot to learn in that area, I think there's also a lot to be able to explain the fact that we do have a lot of understanding about where sexual impulses come from and why they exist in human beings and how they impact our decision making. It's a very powerful drive. And knowing that whatever the sexual desire is, whatever the sexual attraction is, it comes from that part of our brain that we were designed to have, can certainly help us in trying to explain things as a matter of literally being an instinct and a survival type of approach in processing our experiences. Now, I think there's a lot of things that we can do to be able to work through the questions that come to those who are confused by a same-gender attraction. And that's something that we do work with people on, is trying to make sense of that, trying to find balance and find peace with the fact that one may experience a certain impulse or a certain trigger, and they can understand it for what it is and not be ashamed of that, but also be aware of the fact that decisions can happen in conjunction with those impulses, whether they're in favor of them and supporting them and helping to carry them out, or whether they're actually contrary to those impulses, a decision that would allow you to not carry out that impulse. So hopefully I'm making some sense on that. It's definitely a sensitive area where, because we're still learning a lot, we're still trying to be able to make more and more sense of why there are those individuals who do experience the same gender attraction and others who do not. But the bottom line is that limbic part of the brain is essential for understanding any sexual impulse. And if we do understand that, we can feel better about who we are, no matter what our attraction may be, and make sense of it in terms of being able to manage that behavior as human beings.
Okay, this individual, they've been struggling with masturbation since they were 12 years old, and now they're 23. Because I wanted to know if it's possible to overcome lust and to be able to spend 5 to 6 months without orgasm, masturbation, or wet dreams, and sex and porn.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think a big part of that question is the fact that it started at a fairly young age and that it has remained with that individual. And so probably a lot of that question is, this has been with me for a long time. What can I do to ultimately make a change, and how do I deal with that? So I guess there's a couple components to mention. One is that at 12 years old, that's a time of great change in life. That's when puberty is really starting to kick in, especially for boys. 12 to 14, that's really when it starts to take hold, and those changes start to happen, where things of a sexual nature start to really become an interest, and the natural changes, such as the wet dreams and the discovery of an attraction to either the opposite gender or the same gender, in a sexual manner begins to take form. And so the curiosity is certainly huge at that age. It's kind of a newfound experience. So suddenly you're sort of a young adult with a kind of a children's brain, if you will, because our logic hasn't developed yet, and so we're not quite sure how to make total sense of all of the physiological and biological changes that are happening at that age. And so we start to experiment, and experimentation and curiosity and just learning more and more about our own bodies as well as the bodies of other people help us to develop that interest as well as that urge. And certainly we discover that certain things feel good and certain things are rewarding, and so we start to reward our brains as we do experiment and start to receive those rewards in that way. So, and then transitioning to the question about whether it can be overcome, most definitely it can be overcome. I've seen many people who have been able to identify, why is it that I'm experiencing such a strong desire to do this? What many people do define a lustful feeling as part of their experience, where they're feeling almost a insatiable desire to act out, and since they don't have necessarily a partner to have a sexual encounter with, and age obviously has a lot to do with that. Also decisions about pairing up with somebody, but because there's more of an individual experience typically at that age, those habits can form as a simple cycle of triggers and rewards. And but it is definitely possible to work through those things as somebody starts to figure out, okay, why do I have such an impulse? Understanding the natural elements of that, but also understanding that the logic part of our brain takes a while to catch up, and so the ability to master the sexual impulses that come at a young age, it can take some time to learn that and to feel like there's a sense of ability to manage that. It is definitely possible. I've seen lots of people really take hold of those kinds of behaviors that seem nearly impossible to get over, and they've been able to find other ways to cope. And I guess the final comment to answer this question would be that oftentimes the sexual response can essentially become a way to cope. And so coping mechanisms, as we understand coping mechanisms, we start to realize that there are certain situations that cause us to want to cope. And in fact, Tony's showing on the screen right now some of the typical scenarios that we experience when we feel the need to cope. So if we're bored, if we're lonely, I hear a lot of clients who talk about feeling a lot of stress, feeling overwhelmed, they're afraid. So those types of emotions and situations can often trigger a desire to cope. And so when we know that a reward is very easy to achieve through a sexual behavior, and it's very fast to achieve that and to cope, then we can turn to that as a coping mechanism very, very easily. But as we learn other ways to cope with those kinds of difficult emotions and situations, as we learn about trigger management, and as we learn about the scenarios, the life scenarios that are more often causing us those coping situations, we're better able to plan how to deal with those. And so in the course of learning coping strategies, thought management, and simply understanding the nature of the sexual experience and the sexual impulse, all those things can come together to really help us to manage that behavior over time, and it's certainly possible, definitely.
This next question comes from a spouse who just found out that their husband has been viewing porn, and it's a two-part question. What can she do to help him, and what can she do to help herself?
Wonderful question. I'm so glad this question came in, because it's something that many partners and spouses of those who are struggling with a sexual addiction are afraid to ask, or don't even know that they want to ask, because it's such a difficult topic to get into. Many people in a supporting role, such as a spouse or a partner or a family member, are afraid to bring up their own needs because of the potential to worsen the situation with their loved one. And they're also afraid to ask how they can support the one who is struggling with addictive behavior because they don't want to worsen it. So it's kind of the same challenge both ways. Is I don't want to worsen the situation. I don't want to trigger him or her. I don't want to create any further problems. I just want to help. So number one, I think I'll answer the question about the supporting role, how that supporting person can support the person recovering from addiction effectively. One thing is that one of the very first things that we get into as we meet with spouses and partners of those recovering from addiction is to think about the difference between their behavior and the emotions associated with that and what their actual desires are. Knowing that that person is not attempting to replace their loved one with that sexual behavior. They're not attempting to substitute for their wife or husband. That's one of the major things that can help the supporting person, but it's also something that can help the person recovering because they're better understood. And another element is the aspect of feeling ashamed of that behavior. Shame is one of the most powerful human emotions that we can experience. It's deeply, deeply embedded. When we do something that we're not proud of, shame can definitely perpetuate the addictive cycle tremendously. It keeps things secret. It keeps things in the dark. It keeps things separate. It keeps us from communicating. And so one of the things that we talk about a lot with couples as they come together in this process is the idea of being able to communicate more openly about it, not in a shameful way, but in a way that does promote better decisions and a healthy, open relationship. Honesty is such an important aspect. And so I think understanding the difference between the person's shame and their desire to improve, which we would actually term as guilt, guilt about behavior that they don't want but continue to be engaged in, that can help them, both parties really, feel better about the process that they're engaged in and trying to overcome that process together. So communication is one very important aspect that a supporting person can help with. Be there for them. Be willing to listen. Be willing to simply hear the challenges that they're experiencing without attempting to resolve it, without attempting to cure or give advice, but simply listening. Those are some very important aspects in a supporting role. Now, in terms of the person who is supporting also working through the challenges that they experience, such as a spouse of someone who's recovering from addiction, that spouse also has very significant needs. We often work with the spouse both together in a joint session, but also separately, individually, because they do have such very powerful needs in their own way. One of those needs is to feel that they are still loved despite that behavior of the person who's struggling with addiction. I think that's one of the greatest miscommunications and misunderstandings that can happen. So know, as a spouse, as a supporting person, know that that behavior is not intended to replace you. It's not intended to intervene or block that relationship. Know that that is not meant to harm you. Knowing that is a huge benefit to being able to see positive growth opportunities in that recovery process. So I hope I've covered some good ideas for you, but I think bottom line is that the supporting person has a lot of needs as well. There's a lot of emotions, a lot of things for them to work through and process and understand, not only about addiction itself, but also about their relationship and about the emotions that they experience as that process is going on.
I quit using porn and now I feel worse. Is this normal?
That's a really interesting question because there are many who go through a process of change and recovery from addiction and will feel like things are really not actually better, even though the behavior management is actually better. And what's interesting, we kind of refer to it as being dragged through the mud sometimes because it feels like even though you're working hard and you're finding some success in managing the unwanted addictive behavior, it also feels like you feel empty at times. You feel isolated, maybe misunderstood, or maybe like you've given up some of the rewarding elements of life, and that you don't really know how else life can be rewarding. I kind of like to use an analogy where, let's say you lived in a place that was extremely hot. Let's say I don't know, Arizona or Mexico or Ecuador or somewhere where the average temperature is much higher than, say, where we are in Utah. And you know, as you get acclimated to that temperature, a higher temperature is going to feel more normal than a colder temperature. And then if you come back to a colder temperature, you're going to be cold. You're going to feel the effects of that because you're not acclimated to that cold temperature. So the reason why I use that analogy is because as you're changing behaviors and you're looking for new ways of coping, the brain has to kind of acclimate to the new kinds of strategies that you're using in your life to cope. And so often it can feel like, well, this is too hot or too cold, and I'm not too satisfied with what I'm experiencing right now. And so literally the brain has to make some adjustments and heal over time to be able to you know, kind of find the same, or not, I wouldn't say the same, but to find rewards in normal life experiences that are not addictive behaviors. So that acclimation, there's actually a term that some people may have heard of called neuroplasticity. It's literally the process of changing the brain, the neural connections in the brain, to allow new processes to take form. In other words, being able to change behaviors in certain situations, going from an addictive behavior to a more healthy coping behavior, and you know, to be able to feel rewarded and to feel happy, to feel peace after such a change takes place can take some time. It can take some acclimation, if you will, for that brain process to start to take hold, and it can be something that might be frustrating for a time because it feels like the rewards have gone away in a lot of ways, and that you're searching for new ways to reward yourself. Really, it's more about the brain acclimating again to some of the natural rewards of life that are separate from addictive behavior. I hope that helps answer that question.
How do I cope with porn flashbacks, with images that keep coming back after they are trying to quit?
What an awesome question that is, too. That is wonderful because I think that's important for those who are further along in the change process to be able to understand. So just real quickly, a reason why that happens is that the limbic system, as I've mentioned a few times tonight, has built within it not only the emotions and the survival instincts, but it also has the memories attached in that process. Those are the neural connections within that part of the brain that cause us to have memories. And because the memories are tied into the emotions and the impulsive area of the brain, the reward center of the brain, definitely the brain is going to call upon those memories in a very powerful way at times as it tries to sort of talk you into engaging in that behavior. It's true that simply remembering an image can bring a reward. And so that is something that can happen very, very definitely for a long period of time, even after the addictive behavior has stopped. So one of the things that we would talk about in terms of being able to manage that and deal with that is to engage in healthy coping behaviors. So for example, if we find that we are continually recalling a specific image or a certain type of image, and that is triggering and it's difficult and it's upsetting, something that we can do is we can start to plan some ways to deal with those, just as we would a trigger, just as we would an impulse to act out on an addictive behavior. So, for example, some people may find that their memory is most often coming to them in situations when they are feeling lonely or tired. And so because they're lonely or tired, they have the chance to ponder and go into those memories more. And so something that we would probably work on is a plan for engaging the thinking part of the brain far more at that moment, so that the thinking part of the brain can start to help us work through other things, start to gain control of our thoughts, start to gain control of the situation, kind of be in the moment and understand what it is, but be able to engage in specific intentional activities so that we are able to move past the impulsive memories that are coming up. So that's just one quick example. There are many examples, but in therapy, I think one of the huge benefits of therapy is to be able to talk through in detail what exactly that individual is experiencing and when. And as a result of finding out when it's happening, you can start to form plans for dealing with those moments. Be intentional, be in the moment in terms of helping the thinking part of the brain to, again, take charge of the situation and move forward from there.
Here we've got somebody who's sounds like they're trying to hold on. They're saying, must I destroy and delete all my porn?
So was the question, do I need to destroy all of the porn?
Yes, it sounds like he or she has a stash, and he's wondering if they need to destroy it or delete it all.
Okay, I see. Well, I guess my immediate thought on that is that it certainly would be helpful in terms of being able to manage an addictive behavior, if that is an addictive behavior that you're experiencing or have experienced in the past. It's kind of like if somebody is addicted to a substance, alcohol or drugs, for example, if they remove that from their environment, they're going to be far more able to handle those triggers and temptations to use that than they would be if they were sitting in a bar or sitting next to someone that was going to provide the drugs that they wanted. So obviously the ability to manage that behavior is going to be stronger if you're not in a situation where you're immediately tempted to look at something. So that would be a help. Now, at the same time, I would say that because sexual behavior and sexual urges are a human instinct, I would also mention that that's not necessarily the only thing that would need to be done in order to manage that sexual addiction, because it's a part of us, and obviously we live in a world in which many things are very sexualized. Media, movies and music and advertising and all kinds of things are very sexual in nature. Even a simple perusal of the internet or social media can result in seeing something that's even mildly sexually enticing and can draw you in. And so I think knowing that, not just getting rid of the immediate risk, the immediate source of unwanted behavior is the answer. But I think additionally there are other things to do to be aware that, the sexual impulse, number one, is part of us, and so we have to be able to manage that regardless of what's around us, knowing that there will always be content around us that could be sexually appealing to us. But number two, knowing that, the more you do avoid the content and not have the content available to you, the easier it will be for you to manage the impulses around that.
I have a therapist who I really like and is helping me in other ways, but they don't know how to help me with pornography addiction. What can I do to help them help me?
That's a really good question as well. I'm so glad that we have such a willingness to ask some of these tough questions, the truth is that there are many great therapists out there who are not as familiar with how to deal with the idea of pornography addiction or other sexual addictions. Um, One reason for that is because it isn't necessarily defined as an addiction by many people, and so therefore it's not necessarily um, studied or worked on tremendously by a lot of the therapists out there. Um, so that's one reason why there are therapists who aren't as familiar with how to help with that. And I think it's also something that is fairly specialized. Most therapists these days are finding a niche, what they're really good at, what they understand really well, and they stick with that. And so other areas such as sexual addiction, pornography addiction, may not be an area of expertise for them. So, as an example, somebody might be really good at working with depression or anxiety. Maybe they're good at helping somebody with eating disorders or relationship problems, but they're not good at working on that pornography addiction. And I do think that it is something that you can benefit greatly from reaching out to somebody who has studied that specific area more and has more expertise in working with people who struggle with that issue. So I guess the short answer is not every therapist is able to help with pornography addiction. There are many who would probably do well to refer out that kind of help to those who are more familiar with it, more experienced with it, and understand that better. And certainly we're happy to help with that if possible. And there are other good therapists too, but we're certainly helpful or willing to help in that area because it is a very specialized area, and it's being recognized more and more, but it hasn't been as widely recognized throughout the world historically. So I think that's one of the reasons for that.
I want to stop viewing porn. I want to give it up bad, but I feel so sad about giving it up. Why?
Another great question. I have experienced that with a number of people with whom I have worked in therapy. They feel like it's difficult to actually face the idea of giving it up. One of the reasons for that is because it is a very rewarding experience. It's very rewarding to be able to act out and to give the pleasure center of the brain that experience. We have chemical releases that are going on in the brain, and to put it bluntly, they feel good when they're experienced. The dopamine, the adrenaline, the oxytocin, the serotonin, all those kinds of chemical changes that take place in the brain when we go through a sexual experience provide a very positive experience, at least in that moment. Now afterwards, that usually changes. Usually there's a different feeling of sorrow and guilt or shame or both, and other feelings of being isolated, being lonely, and so forth. But because of the nature of the fact that it's so rewarding in that moment, and it's such a the build up to that moment is also very enjoyable. The thrill, so to speak, of inching closer to a sexual experience is enough that it feels like we really want that, and that is an instinctual response that we're going to have. So to face the idea of giving that up can be really daunting because we're often not sure that we'll be able to feel the same kinds of rewards in other areas of our life. So a few minutes ago I mentioned the idea of sort of acclimating to a new temperature, meaning that we are able to adjust to receiving rewards and experiencing rewards in normal life activities that are not addictive activities. And so we're able to adapt and feel rewarded even though we're not acting out in that sort of addictive behavior. It's hard to grasp that idea when one is considering change. And so I think because it's hard for that, it can be very difficult to find the motivation. Usually the negative consequences of continued addictive behavior eventually outweigh the desire to sort of keep that reward. And those negative consequences start to cause an imbalance, and then change is wanted. But I can definitely speak, after having worked with a lot of people on this, that they are able to find other, or I should say, they're able to find rewards that are rewarding in other ways. And even in a sexual way, there are rewards that come as well, even if the addictive behavior stops. But with sexual behavior with a loved one, um, the rewards can also be very wonderful, and can help take care of that sort of experience sadness, if you will, of the prospect of change. So I hope that made sense. I'm not sure if I was very articulate on that answer, but hopefully that makes some sense.
What can I do if I relapse or am in danger of relapsing?
Wonderful question. My first thought on that is to simply reach out to somebody for help. Um, Reaching out has a lot of really great effects. It helps us to feel like we're supported. It helps us to feel like we are not alone in facing addictive behavior and recovery. Um, and it helps us to understand that the ability to connect with other people is in itself a rewarding experience. So that connection can actually help us to feel that reward, that sense of security, that sense of peace and happiness, and that reward can actually be very helpful in overcoming the feeling of being close to relapse. So reaching out to others, I think, is one huge step that's very helpful. Talk to somebody you trust. Um, Even if you don't necessarily reveal every detail of what you're experiencing, which sometimes can keep us from reaching out to others, we don't necessarily have to share every detail about it. You know, we don't have to reach out to a spouse or a friend or a parent um, and tell them exactly what we're feeling. We can use other language that just says, hey, we need help. So, for example, I could reach out and say, I'm just struggling right now for a few minutes. I'm kind of in a bad moment, and I just wanted to reach out and talk to somebody. I just need somebody to kind of talk to me right now and help me through a difficult moment, and kind of reassure me and help me through this. And there's not even a need to be detailed about that. I think that can be a huge help, because so many of those who struggle with recovery and the potential for relapse feel like they have to be totally open and communicate every vivid detail of what they're experiencing, and they're ashamed to do that. So they don't, and that can be something that hinders the recovery process, and relapse can often follow. So be willing to be real and reach out for help, but at the same time know that it doesn't really matter if you're sharing the details of what you're struggling with. Just be real and say, hey, I need some help. Can you just talk to me for right now? I need someone to share this moment with me and help me through this. And then, of course, there are other things that you can do besides reaching out to other people. Um, you can also engage in healthy behaviors that you plan on in advance when you are likely to experience a trigger, and the potential for relapse is there. Some people will turn to exercise, or they'll turn to a social event, or something that is a healthy behavior that they can simply rely on as something that feels good and appropriate and helpful. It gives them the strength to be able to move forward without actually relapsing.
I was also going to say one of the things that a lot of people have used as one of their I guess not coping mechanism, but as a strategy that when the trigger comes, because they come to everybody, but is to
Yeah.
reach out and help somebody. Not even necessarily to reach out for help for yourself, but reach out and help somebody else. Because then we engage our prefrontal cortex and we start thinking about other people instead of our own wants and desires at that moment.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tony. I like that too. That's another reason why connecting with other people in a difficult moment can be helpful. That's very clear.
I need porn to calm me down or help me to go to sleep. What can I do when I'm trying to stop?
Very good question. I love that question, because it's based on someone's real experience. And I know I've heard that so many times from people as they say, this helps me to relax. This helps me to deal with life. It helps me to just work through things that are stressful and difficult, and I need it as a coping mechanism. Well, the truth is we do need to find coping mechanisms, but it is possible to find other ways to cope with that. One of the things that I like to talk about with clients a lot is the idea of being very mindful. There's a technique in therapy called mindfulness, which is based on basically slowing things down in our lives to the point where we can really focus on the here and now. We can focus on the physical experience of our life in that very moment. Literally, to the point of focusing on even our breathing and the sound of what we're hearing, and gently recognizing the thoughts that we're experiencing, to be able to see them, acknowledge them, and gently kind of push them out of the way so that we can still be in that moment. There's great power in being able to slow down and be mindful of our physical experience in that moment. And I use the term slow down especially because it's so important to be able um, to allow the logical part of the brain, the thinking part of the brain, to have a chance, to have a fighter's chance, if you will. If we're very limbic oriented, meaning that we're trying to deal with something in a very limbic way, um, then the chances of us being able to change that behavior are pretty slim just because it's so automated. It's such an instinctual thing. But when we start to slow down and realize what we're experiencing and why, and just be in that very, very slow, real moment, we're able to engage our thoughts, and our power to be able to make better decisions is going to come to life. So it's amazing how that works. But I do think that there are a lot of mindfulness types of activities. It's a lot like meditation, but there are very mindful based activities all over the internet. If you want to take a look at some of those, do some searches, safe searches, if you will, on YouTube and elsewhere on the internet. Look for things like guided mindfulness exercises or mindfulness techniques or things like that to be able to actually find some things that can walk you through literally with somebody talking you through a mindfulness exercise. That can be a huge help for you.
Does it help to view porn as immoral?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Does it help to view porn as immoral? Well, I don't know if that's something that I can really answer for the person who's asking that question. I think it really greatly depends on the individual who is trying to work through that challenge, because there are those who do not view pornography as being immoral, and there are those who do view it as being immoral. Either way, it can become an addictive behavior in one's life. Um,
Would they'd
so
have to be kind of careful that it doesn't go into shame, though, correct? If you're viewing it
yeah,
as immoral, I mean, even if you believe it is or you believe it's not, it could still kick you into the shame cycle if you're not careful.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, shame can definitely kick in, especially if it's viewed as something that's immoral. Shame can definitely be even more pronounced because you feel like you're doing something that's not only unwanted, but it's also unacceptable. And so I think that's a very important difference to make. Or sorry, a different point to call out is that if somebody does view it as immoral, it's considered unacceptable, and therefore the shame is very intense. Um, so, while I cannot dictate whether a person views it as immoral or not, what I can speak to is the fact that um, it's something that can be disruptive and be damaging to people, regardless of their view of whether it's moral or not. It can cause great imbalance. It can interfere with relationships very, very significantly, and it can harm other areas of life, such as work and just coping with other challenges of life. Often people who are experiencing the addictive elements of pornography also feel very depressed. They might feel very high anxiety. They might have some other mental health challenges as well because it does interrelate with so many of those other types of experiences. So getting back to the original question of would it help if I view it as immoral, I think most of all it would help to view it as something that's potentially disruptive to your life if in fact you feel like it is disruptive to your life. Um, so again, going back to, everyone has their own value systems and everyone's going to be able to decide for themselves whether they view it as moral or immoral. The bottom line is that it does create disruption and problematic tendencies that can be very disruptive in life, and it also can change our ability to connect with other people. It can change our ability to find rewards in a different kind of sexual experience. For example, being intimate with a spouse, that experience can be greatly impacted by a pornography addiction. So knowing that it can be so disruptive and change the way we view other elements of life is probably a better way to look at the impact of it.
There's kind of a follow-up question to that. He wants to know, is it bigger challenge for religious people?
Oh, okay. Very good question. Um,
So I guess
I
that
would
kind of
I would
follows up
say
why
that.
he thinks it's immoral. He's wondering that balance because he is a religious person.
Okay. So yeah, so being a religious person, does that make the recovery process more difficult? Um, I would say in some ways it can increase the shame that we feel. If we feel like we are um, not only doing something that we don't like, but that is unacceptable, as I've said before, if we view it as something that is sinful or contrary to our value system, our religious beliefs, then that's likely to increase the shame that we feel, and that can be a more difficult barrier to overcome. On the other hand, I would also say that if someone's religious, then their faith in a supreme being is going to be a strength to them. Because in addiction recovery, we talk about an idea called surrendering, and as you've got Tony on the screen right now, the idea of surrender is that you acknowledge an overwhelming ability for what we call the addictive behavior, uh, the limbic response to a situation. We allow it we recognize that it has tremendous influence on us if we allow it to. And we know that it does have tremendous power, and we recognize that influence in our lives. But on the other hand, by surrendering to that acknowledged force, we also empower ourselves. Kind of ironically, I guess, in a way, we empower ourselves because of that surrendering. We empower ourselves to say, I know that it has the ability to have a tremendous power over me, but I know because of it that I can also recognize it for what it is and find ways to overcome it. So, I definitely feel like those who are religious and turn to a higher power as a source of strength in their life, they do have an additional strength in that battle to be able to find more strength beyond their own, um, and they find a lot of success as they do lean on that extra help.
Okay, well, we are approaching our hour. Actually, we are at our hour. Do you have time for one more question?
Okay.
Okay. First, we want to thank everybody for attending tonight and for these questions. They've definitely put Torrey to work in answering them, and especially on the fly. That's what's always so fun about this. You never know what you're going to get. But this last question here, which I think a lot of people can relate to, he says, well, what do I do when I have so much sexual energy? What do I do with it? What do I do?
Oh, that's another really good question. I'm so grateful that everybody's willing to submit these questions. It's awesome. So what do you do with so much sexual energy? It's interesting because there are some people who have a far more active sex drive than others. and so they're far more inclined to be looking for sexual experiences than others. It's just kind of an interesting way that we're naturally composed, if you will, or naturally wired within our brains and our physical bodies. And so something that we often talk about is simply being able to engage in behaviors that we are finding as being in alignment with our value system and also our responsibilities, essentially. So in other words, if we have a significant other with whom we have a sexual relationship, certainly engaging in that kind of an intimate relationship can be a healthy behavior in terms of being able to experience the sexual drive that, or act on that sexual drive that we're experiencing. But also there are other behaviors that we can start to implement in our lives that are very helpful. One of the things that I like to talk about is acceptance of it, number one. Number one, being able to say, hey, it's great that my body's working. It's great that I have a sexual instinct that is strong and healthy and powerful. Isn't that wonderful that I'm wired that way and that I'm able to feel that, and my body is working the way it was designed to work. So acceptance of it is, I think, one of the very important things, and we can feel a lot of positive emotions around that if we accept it in that way, and that's a huge help. And then number two would be just some other healthy behaviors that can be rewarding in other ways. Finding ways to connect with people in a non-sexual way can be very rewarding too, and it can help us to be able to balance the ongoing sexual drive that we do experience. So connecting with other people, finding activities that are rewarding to us in healthy ways that are acceptable, and that we feel good about as a way to balance out those sexual drive experiences, that can be helpful too. I think it's kind of interesting is if you sit and think about something all the time, it essentially becomes everything that you do, right? If that's all you think about, it's front and center in your mind all the time, and it can be a bigger challenge. Whereas if it's not something that you're always focused on, it can be better managed. And so I think, truth is, when we work with someone who's trying to recover from addiction, we talk about a lot of different things. We don't just talk about addictive behavior because there are other things that are relevant in that person's life. And so I think being able to say, well, yeah, sexual drive is a big part of who I am, but it's not all I am. There are other aspects of your life that you can also focus on and be rewarded by. We could talk through different ways to do that, but I think that's something that could be helpful as well.
Well, thank you very much, Torrey. We appreciate you taking your time tonight to answer these questions. We appreciate everybody joining us. I want to leave with this last slide. I love this slide because it's so true. One time is too many, and 1,000 times is never enough. We can never get enough of what we don't need. So hope you remember that. Thank you so much for joining us. Go ahead and continue to send in your questions. We'll add it to the queue for next month. And as always, thank you, thank you, thank you. Have a wonderful night.
Good night.